The wind howled through the fjords, carrying the scent of brine and rot. Cold mist clung to the stones as Erik Jarlsson led his men through the coastal woods of northern Norway. It was the winter of 840 AD, and the village of Svartheim had sent for warriors. Strange things had been happening, the villagers said, but details were few. Livestock was missing, men who ventured into the forest didn't return, and the night brought unsettling sounds, like the groaning of the dead. Erik's warband had been seasoned by years of battle, hardened by raids along the English coast. There was little they feared, and the promise of silver for their services was enough to draw them to Svartheim. As they marched, the snow began to fall, thick and silent, swallowing the world in white. By nightfall, they arrived at the outskirts of the village. It was a small, bleak settlement, surrounded by thick pines that seemed to lean in with the weight of secrets. A single torch flickered near the longhouse where the village chieftain, Torvald, waited. "Welcome, Erik," Torvald greeted, his face drawn with worry. "We are glad you have come. The gods curse us, and the dead do not rest." Erik brushed off the cold, stepping inside the longhouse with his men. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the stench of fear. The villagers, huddled in corners, murmured to each other, eyes darting nervously to the windows. Torvald explained the village's plight over a cup of weak mead. For weeks now, they had seen shadows in the forest, figures that seemed human but moved unnaturally, as if their bones had forgotten how to bend. Those who vanished into the woods were sometimes heard screaming, but no bodies were ever found. "They're Draugr," Torvald whispered, the word heavy with dread. "The dead have risen." The warband exchanged uneasy glances. Erik had heard the old stories. The Draugr were cursed undead, vengeful spirits bound to their corpses, guarding their burial mounds and treasures. But those were tales for children, myths to keep them in line. Still, the fear in Torvald's eyes was real. Erik decided they would investigate. He wasn't one to let superstitions cloud his judgment, but he also wasn't a fool. He sent 2 of his men to scout the edge of the forest where the disappearances had occurred. The rest of the warband stayed behind to guard the village, sharpening their blades and preparing for what might come. The scouts didn't return. The next morning, Erik took his remaining men and marched into the forest. The snow crunched under their boots, and the trees pressed in from all sides, casting long shadows despite the early light. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant call of a crow. After hours of searching, they came upon a clearing. At the center of it stood an ancient burial mound, overgrown with moss and snow. Erik's breath caught in his throat. The air here felt thick, as though the world itself was holding its breath. "This is it," said Bjorn, Erik's second in command. "This is where they came from." Erik nodded. He could feel it too, a sense of wrongness, like a stain on the land. They approached the mound cautiously, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the forest for movement. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. Erik stumbled, catching himself on his shield, just as the snow before the mound began to shift. From the earth, pale hands clawed their way up, dragging ancient, withered bodies from the ground. The Draugr rose slowly, their faces twisted in eternal rage, eyes burning with a cold, blue light. Their skin was gray and stretched tight over their bones, and their armor was rusted, but their strength was undeniable. "Form up!" Erik shouted, rallying his men. They quickly fell into formation, shields raised, swords drawn. The Draugr moved with unnerving speed for creatures so ancient, launching themselves at the warband with inhuman strength. Steel met bone and decayed flesh as the warriors fought back, but it was like trying to hack through stone. The Draugr were relentless, shrugging off blows that would have felled any living man. Bjorn swung his axe with all his might, cleaving one of the creatures in half, but even as it fell, another took its place. Erik drove his sword through a Draugr's chest, only to have it pull itself off the blade, hissing through broken teeth. "They don't die," one of the men screamed, panic rising. "Hold the line." Erik barked, but it was no use. The Draugr overwhelmed them, dragging men down into the snow, ripping them apart with savage fury. Erik fought with everything he had, his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But there were too many. He saw Bjorn fall, then another man, and another. Soon, it was just him, standing alone against the horde. Then, from the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. Taller than the others, more regal, with a crown of rusted iron atop its skeletal head. This was no ordinary Draugr. This was their king. The Draugr king pointed a bony finger at Eric, and the ground beneath him cracked open. From the fissures, cold, pale arms reached out, grabbing at his legs, pulling him down. Eric struggled, but it was like fighting quicksand. The more he thrashed, the deeper he sank. The last thing he saw before the earth swallowed him was the cold, dead eyes of the Draugr king, staring down at him with ancient malice. In Svartheim, the night passed in eerie silence. The villagers huddled in their homes, praying to the gods for protection. But the gods were silent. Torvald stood at the entrance to the longhouse, staring out into the dark. He had sent the warriors into the woods, and none had returned. He feared the worst. Then, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, he saw them, figures emerging from the forest, slowly making their way toward the village. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. Perhaps Eric and his men had triumphed. But as they drew closer, Torvald's blood ran cold. These were not men. The Draugr had come. They moved like shadows, silent and implacable, their dead eyes fixed on the village. Behind them, towering above the others, was the Draugr king, his crown glinting in the weak morning light. Torvald backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what was coming. The village had no warriors left, no defense against the ancient evil that now bore down upon them. As the first of the Draugr reached the village, a scream pierced the air, and then another. The Draugr tore through the settlement like a plague, killing indiscriminately, dragging men, women, and children from their homes. Torvald ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was nowhere to go. The Draugr were everywhere, their cold hands pulling him to the ground. As he struggled, he caught one last glimpse of the Draugr king, standing at the edge of the village, watching with eyes that had seen centuries of death. And then, there was only darkness.